On January 15th, 2019, Jesse Singal posted a thread defending the sea lion from the comic strip Wonder Mark, a character who exists entirely within a single comic strip designed to make a point about his behavior. 2 years later, Singal returned to this point, acknowledging and then ignoring a statement from the creator, which explains that no, the sea lion is not meant to be interpreted as representing a marginalized group, a fact which most other people figured out from everything else about the strip. Hi, I'm Unexamined Life. I'm represented for this video by a picture of a sea lion, and that's all I'm going to say about Jesse Singal's personality. I'm here to discuss Jesse Singal's work, particularly his work regarding trans people, in a completely professional and respectful way, with the exception of that bit I just did. And arguably this bit that's kind of gloating about it. You might be thinking that talking about Jesse Singal in 2022 is a little past its expiration date. Indeed, Jesse Singal is not as mainstream as he once was. He has a profitable Substack and a popular podcast, as well as a book that came out last year. But it's been a while since his big, discourse-shaking articles about trans people. But while I am part of the trans orthodoxy, I'm not making this to try and persuade you Jesse Singal is bad and evil. I don't want to cancel him. Mostly, I just want to hurt his feelings a little. Okay, I don't want to do that either. I'm making this video because in politics, it can be just as important to understand where someone went wrong as it is to understand that they went wrong. The problems of understanding about trans people that I see in Jesse Singal's writing are common problems for cisgender authors who write about trans people. For this reason, exploring exactly what the problem with them is has value, both for people who want to write about marginalized groups they don't belong to, and for people who just want to be equipped to be suspicious of articles that aren't telling the whole story. For this video, I'm going to look at two of his big pieces about trans people, and talk about where I think they go wrong, then look a little at his Substack, and end with doing something very risky and trying to build a little story about how I think Jesse Singal might have ended up making the specific mistakes he makes. Thus, Jesse Singal will be destroyed in the marketplace of ideas, and my narrow-minded trans overlords will bathe in his blood. The first piece we're going to look at is called How the Fight Over Transgender Kids Got a Leading Sex Researcher Fired. It's an article that doesn't have any of the most obvious cues of bias. It's not some hateful, angry screed, and the tone is centrist and precise. That said, when I mention the leading sex researcher in question is Kenneth Zucker, any trans people listening will probably know where this is going. Jesse Singal introduces us to Kenneth Zucker, head of the Gender Identity Clinic in Toronto. Zucker's clinic, we're told, is controversial among trans people, and they've been putting political pressure on the clinic for some time. This finally results in the Center for Addiction and Mental Health commissioning an external report on Zucker, which is little more than a hack hit job stringing together anonymous accusations, one of which wasn't even about Zucker at all. What position is the article taking here? Well, it thinks this political pressure is bad, and that the ideas that Zucker's clinic explores are more moderate and reasonable than trans people give him credit for. He says, many activists see this approach as a rejection of young children's transgender identities, and Zucker as its regressive standard bearer. As a result, the GIC had been tarred for years as a conversion or reparative therapy clinic, terms which conjure images of outfits operated out of backwoods shacks in the Bible Belt. This, Singal argues, is simply untrue. Zucker's clinic never attempted to force anyone into not being trans. It simply questions whether every child who says they're uncomfortable in their gender automatically is. Even wondering that, Singal suggests, is apparently transphobic now. The overall claim is clear. If the clinic were conversion therapy, that is, if it were pressuring children to be the gender assigned to them at birth, that would be bad. Fortunately, however, it isn't. There are two things missing from this piece, both of which are good reasons to be a little suspicious of it. The first is a single word from one of the trans people who are angry at this clinic. The only one he talks to at all in the article is the one who mistakenly remembered Kenneth Zucker as making a nasty remark that in fact was from someone else. Jesse Singal talks about trans people who dislike Zucker quite a lot, but he never offers them a voice. That should always raise your suspicions about an article. If a long professional piece is about a group, but never lets you hear from them, it's at best sloppy, and at worst, hiding something. The other odd absence is Kenneth Zucker. You would think an article all about how Zucker was targeted for his beliefs and practice would include a healthy serving of Zucker explaining what those beliefs and practice were. But instead, Singal does that almost entirely through his own voice. And again, that should worry you. It should make you ask whether Zucker actually fits the mold Singal is trying to pour him in. So what does Kenneth Zucker himself say about his practice? Does it back up Jesse Singal's argument that he asks reasonable questions but could never be accused of practicing conversion therapy? In his article, Children with Gender Identity Disorder, Is There a Best Practice?, Zucker writes, I would argue, therefore, that it is as legitimate to want to make youngsters comfortable with their gender identity, to make it correspond to the physical reality of their biological sex, as it is to make youngsters comfortable with their ethnic identity, to make it correspond to the physical reality of the color of their skin. He's also said in interviews that if parents clearly want to reduce their child's desire to be of the other gender, then the therapeutic approach is organized around this goal. Singal specifically argued Zucker would never discourage a child from playing freely. Zucker characterizing not interfering with how a child plays as reinforcing the behavior, and puts limit setting of cross-gender behaviors as one of the fundamental aspects of his approach. So, that's weird. In the light of Zucker freely admitting that he was 100% doing conversion therapy because he believes in conversion therapy, it's hard not to see some motivated turns in how Singal treats the evidence against him. For instance, he thinks it's very suspicious that the report includes testimony from a psychiatrist who worked with Zucker's patients, that they were racked with shame and anxiety by the treatment, rather than quoting the patients themselves. Is that really unusual, especially in the case of actual children? He meets one story of Zucker telling a kid they're too smart to be trans, by mentioning that the lawyer declined to comment, and then ignoring it, as if Zucker's lawyer not denying a statement somehow discredits it. He's also completely baffled by the idea that anyone would ever come back to a place that was traumatizing for them, which shows a very limited understanding both of trauma and of the fact that parents can sometimes do bad things to their children. It's another thing this article was missing, but this is one you wouldn't have been able to guess just by looking at it. The article fails to mention the most likely reason that Zucker's clinic was shut down. That just 6 months before that happening, Ontario, the Canadian province it's in, passed a law banning conversion therapy of trans children. In an article that claims to be dedicated to showing Zucker's clinic was closed because of political pressure, it's pretty odd to simply leave out the clearest example of that political pressure. So, in summary, Jesse Singal took a guy who was openly doing conversion therapy and lost his clinic because of the conversion therapy he was openly doing, and tried to pretend he was being persecuted just for asking a few questions before pumping your kid up with HRT, which is the gay version of heroin. And to do that, he had to silence both the trans people speaking up and the man he was protecting from those trans people. I'm not trying to make Jesse Singal sound bad, but if I were, I sure would have hit the jackpot here. Now, I have a theory about what happened, and it's a little more friendly to Singal than you might think, but we'll get to that later. The next piece we're looking at is from 2018 and is currently titled, when children say they're transgender. I say currently, because if you look at the URL, you can still see it was originally called When a Child Says She's Transgender. In other words, already deciding what gender the child is before you even started reading. To be fair, Singal was likely not involved in that. But yeesh. The narrative of this piece is, again, pretty obvious. Singal is again worried about the mainstream affirming model of care, but this time, he's not going to present us with a specific alternative he prefers. He has several interviews with detransitioners, that is, people who thought they were trans, pursued transition, and eventually decided they weren't. All of the detransitioners say they had issues around gender and mental health that someone should have talked with them about, but it never happened. At the end, he encourages us to remember that trans people and detransitioners don't have to be enemies. The article has an extended conversation with a trans person this time, so points, but not a trans person who disagrees with Jesse Singal's narrative, so half points. Trans people who think there should be fewer barriers to trans care are once again a background presence, and one assigned clearly uncharitable views. Singal says, if you see gender dysphoric 13 and 14-year-olds not as young people with a condition that may or may not indicate a permanent identity, but as trans kids full stop, it makes sense to want to grant them access to transition resources as quickly as possible. This implies trans people who criticize gatekeeping measures are either factually unaware of the existence of detransitioners, or worse, secretly out to trans them against their will. The biggest lack in this article is any interest or exploration into why trans people question gatekeeping. The article mentions that trans people have to jump through many hoops to get care, but it treats this as mostly a reason to distrust trans people's opinion, rather than as an important fact to be put into the balance with concerns about detransitioners. We hear the pain of people who are hurt, so we're told, by too little gatekeeping at length, but the pain of people hurt by too much gatekeeping is skipped over in 2 paragraphs as background. Singal represents the mainstream affirming care model very selectively. In general, Singal seems to think that the affirmative care model means doctors can only say the words, "Yes, you can transition now." He includes a quote of someone informing him that it's more complicated than that, but later in the article still characterizes it as, "Don't question who your clients are. Let them tell you who they are and accept their identity in a nurturing, encouraging manner." If that's what affirmative care is, it's not mainstream. One study found that the WPATH standards used to determine whether a trans person is ready for surgery rejected 40% more people than a universal model used for other surgeries. When I came out as trans, the trans community regularly passed around advice like this: steps for vetting a potential psychiatrist, presenting in the least challenging way possible, and encouragement to hide certain doubts and feelings. I personally know people who had to lie to psychiatrists to get HRT, and are happier for it. Another thing noticeably missing from this article about detransitioners is a sense of scale. We are told that only 0.6% of trans women and 0.3% of trans men who underwent bottom surgery were identified as experiencing regret. That's not detransition there, that's regret at all. But jumping to bottom surgery means we're not getting a good picture of how likely or unlikely it is that a teenager who says they're trans will eventually decide they're not. The highest estimate for detransition I've found is the US Trans Survey, which finds 8% of respondents report detransitioning. That's already not enormous, but there's another factor one Singal ignores entirely. It is the reason the vast majority of detransitioners cite for detransition: transphobia. If you take a random set of teenagers who have detransitioned, 85% will not, as the ones in this article do, cite realizing they weren't trans as a reason. 99% would not cite it as the only reason. The vast majority will talk about unsupportive parents, social stigma, and difficulty getting work. Returning to the USTS, the kinds of detransitioners represented in this article, who Singal has built his entire narrative around, represent 0.4% of respondents. Putting 3 of them to 1 trans person in an article, without informing you of that, is a warped picture indeed. But my largest objection is that the article misses what should be the key step in Singal's case. The fact that detransitioners exist does not itself prove that stricter gatekeeping of transition is the solution. That might surprise you, but think about it a little. Singal's first interviewee says she refused to talk about anything other than transition with her psychiatrist. In other words, the reason she didn't talk about any of her other feelings about mental health and gender was that she didn't want to. To me, this suggests fear. Many trans people, and some detransitioners, including of the type Singal is discussing, feel they can't discuss their doubts about their gender or they'll be denied transition care. In other words, people aren't getting to explore their doubts and fears before transitioning, not in spite of gatekeeping, but because of it. Singal should, but doesn't, at least engage the view that if we want detransitioners to think through their doubts fully, we might try ensuring they are less, not more, at risk of consequences for discussing them. This would be a more honest representation of the affirming method that's mainstream. It's not just the identity that's affirmed, but the doubts that the person feels. Okay, so there's one more thing I should really tell you about this article. I said a little bit ago that the detransitioners who Singal talks to aren't representative of average detransitioners. If you are very convenient for this topic transition, you probably wondered when you heard that how Singal picked out these particular people. This isn't answered in the article at all. They're simply introduced as if they were a random selection. Now, I don't claim to be able to prove this, but the answer is very likely anti-trans organizations, with some particular attention to the one called Fourth Wave Now. It's definitely confirmed one of the parents he talks to in the article is associated with Fourth Wave Now, and all of the detransitioners he speaks to are associated with various groups which I would describe as anti-trans, and are in network with Fourth Wave Now. None of this is mentioned in the article. To read it, you would think these teens have no particular politics at all. Now, I'm a member of the trans orthodoxy, and I paint anyone who disagrees with me about anything as transphobic. But Fourth Wave Now is a lot. Here's them retweeting a fantastically normal response to a charity saying, "Trans is beautiful." Here they are courting anti-vaxxers as fellow enemies to what they call in a tweet below this, the elite media class. And here's them definitely not implying anything at all in their caption to this retweet of a pretty small account to their 18,000 followers. They're intense. Oh, and here they are replying to Jesse Singal, saying they were supposed to be in his article. So, that's not great. Jesse Singal has presented a coordinated group of activists as if they were a random sample of a group they profoundly misrepresent. An uncharitable interpretation would be that Singal believes the stuff Fourth Wave Now does. And I don't quite think that. So, what does Jesse Singal believe? Well, one thing he repeats and defends a lot is that most people who say they have gender dysphoria will desist and not come out as trans. He claims every study finds this. In his article on Zucker, he says, "Some skeptics argue that these studies lump in many kids who aren't that gender dysphoric and who therefore weren't going to become trans anyway. But that's just not true, especially when it comes to the more recent samples." So I'm going to read the titles of the surveys he links to in that very sentence, and see if you can think of any way that someone who isn't that gender dysphoric might have slipped into some of these samples. Feminine behavior in boys, aspects of its outcomes. Effeminate behavior of boys present in childhood, 10 additional years of follow-up. Early effeminate behavior in boys, outcome and significance for homosexuality. The sissy boy syndrome, and the development of homosexuality. Okay, I think you get the idea. He's not looking at studies of people who have gender dysphoria, as he claims. He's looking at studies of kids who someone else thought were kinda gay. Well, it's very funny that scientists saw some boys not being hypermasculine and were so disturbed they did 10 years of follow-up work. This is complete nonsense. Obviously, most people with gender dysphoria are going to desist from transness if your definition of gender dysphoria includes anyone whose uncle thinks they're a fruit. But it wouldn't be fair to dismiss all the sources Singal cites for this reason. Just all but 2 of them. The 2 most recent actually start with children who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria. They then do follow-ups. In these follow-ups, the large majority have not transitioned. Case closed, right? Well, it's a little more complicated. First, the finding suggests that the group who hasn't transitioned are ones who, according to measurements, generally experienced less gender dysphoria, or in other words, might never have been very good fits for the diagnosis. The exact thing that Jesse Singal said could not possibly be happening. However, there's another issue. The kids here are still kinda young. In one of the studies, their mean age on follow-up is 20. That's the mean. That means half are younger. In the other, only around 10 of them would have been older than 18. None of these people would be beyond the influence of an unsupportive family, if they have one. The question of whether they're trans or desisters permanently is still up in the air. Singal is assuming that if someone hasn't come out as trans by their 20s, they never will. It's also worth mentioning that the clinic these children are coming to is Kenneth Zucker's. That's right, Kenneth Zucker, the one that practiced conversion therapy and made children ashamed to express any cross-gender behavior. In other words, it is impossible on multiple fronts to justify writing what Singal does using the evidence Singal presents for it. As a final note, I think that Jesse Singal is addressing the wrong question here. The question Singal should be looking at is if there are high rates of people who receive trans care regretting it. But in fact, those rates are, as he himself has to admit, remarkably low, a fact established by considerably more than 2 studies, and I'll provide links below. This argument might be interpreted as suggesting that there should be people who are hurt by permissive approaches to trans care, but the fact that when you ask that question directly there aren't should settle that. It's nearly time to tell you what I think Jesse Singal's deal is. But before I do, I want to look at a weird little analysis he does from his Substack. It's of a right-wing study about trans people, and don't worry, he does think it's bad. It's very obviously bad, actually. The study tries to compare suicide rates of entire states to estimate trans suicide rates, despite trans people not being the entire population of any state anywhere. It's a silly conclusion that could only be taken seriously by a very desperate right-wing media, or, in this case, the Heritage Foundation, which published it. Singal agrees it's silly and dismisses it. But I couldn't help noticing a bit of a difference between how Singal dismisses this crank anti-trans study and how he dismisses a pretty good but limited study affirming trans care. I nearly had a whole section here looking at how he looks at data regarding trans people, but I spared you. I am merciful and kind. The difference I want to remark on here is Singal doesn't imply anything about the motivations of the right-wing guy. Now, Singal loves to imply things about the motivations of doctors who produce studies showing trans care as effective. In his extraordinarily nitpicky critique of a study finding that trans care benefits people, he says, "There's a race to prove just how wrong Republican politicians are, and to produce evidence showing the treatments work." Accusing a scientist of attempting to knowingly bend their inquiry to support a specific viewpoint is a serious accusation, especially on the subject of children's health care, and it's based on no knowledge of the people involved in the study. So, given that, I think it's pretty striking that such intimations about producing motivated science are completely missing in his discussion of an actually shoddy study published by, and I really can't emphasize this enough, the Heritage Foundation. Legit nonsense produced for a legit right-wing think tank, and somehow it's the other study that he accuses of being politically motivated. This, I think, is the fundamental issue with Jesse Singal. He is extremely aware of the ways that people on the left will sometimes misinterpret something to fit an agenda, or overstate exactly what a study shows, or try to fit events to left-wing narratives. He seems, however, entirely unaware of the ways that people on the political right do the exact same thing, and for narratives and agendas that I would argue are simply worse. If you want a great example of this, consider this tweet, where Jesse Singal says he expects to find some really wacky, hard-to-defend stuff in the textbooks rejected in Florida for including critical race theory, and is surprised when he doesn't. That he was able to listen to the right wing talk about critical race theory and be shocked that it wasn't an organic response to real extreme left-wing thoughts demonstrates a lack of skepticism towards right-wing narratives that, for a journalist in the year of our Lord 2022, is honestly weird. This is made worse by a truly wild level of distrust towards activists and what Singal would call the far left wing, a group that includes most trans people. A large part of this, I believe, is because the parts of the left that he thinks of as extreme are the ones who are aware of and respond appropriately to the ways that the right wing will often distort reality. Because he has somehow made himself so unaware of that and uncritical of it when he sees evidence for it, he dismisses them entirely. He doesn't expect anyone from this part of the left to ever have a valuable criticism for him. This leads to him regularly ignoring it when they do. Here's a leaked email where Singal discusses actual scientist and researcher Julia Serrano, who is, not incidentally here, a trans woman. Julia Serrano sent Jesse Singal an email warning him pretty much exactly how he was going to mess up with his article about Kenneth Zucker. Singal dismissed her as biased and went ahead with it anyway. He talks about how trans people have a groupthink that he thinks is dangerous in reporting, but shows no awareness that he, as a cis person, will also have biases and tendencies that could affect his judgment. This leads Singal to where he ends up. He has no ability to notice how people on the political right distort reality, and he will believe anything whatsoever about people to the left of him. He seems to think bias is a left-wing only phenomenon, and that by skewing right, he will become objective. I personally don't think Singal knew what Zucker was doing and tried to cover it by representing him dishonestly. I think he was completely taken in by Zucker claiming he'd never done anything wrong and it was all the fault of malicious trans people who hated him for being reasonable. I think that story played to Jesse Singal's two enormous blind spots: the inability to notice right-wing beliefs like transphobia, and the willingness to buy any old nonsense about the political left. I think Fourth Wave Now, or whichever anti-trans activist likely directed him to the people he interviewed in his second article, also suckered him in exactly the same way. They said they weren't transphobic and it was just those evil trans rights activists trying to get them, and Singal ate it up. He used his liberal platform to repeat their narratives without a single question, because it fit his worldview. And so, because of his inability to notice transphobia, he ends up reproducing it. He ends up defending a doctor who performed conversion therapy. He paints a group of anti-trans activists as ideologically neutral and representative of a group they do not at all represent, in order to support an approach that might make their situation worse. As someone probably on the left himself, replicating right-wing narratives feels to him like being objective. And when the things he writes are, inevitably, useful to and used by the political right, he shrugs it off. Again, he lacks the ability to criticize that. So what can we learn from the strange, dark story of Jesse Singal? Well, if an article tells you about the people who disagree with its narrative, but never lets you hear them, you should ask questions. If it paints trans people or marginalized people or the left as unreasonable and unaware of obvious facts about the world, you should ask questions. We learn that skepticism is like sunscreen. If you don't apply it everywhere equally, you will end up looking pretty silly. When we think about the different ways the right and left wing distort reality, we might learn something about how kindness isn't always fake and cruelty isn't always authentic. And most of all, we learn it's easy to notice the narratives of people around you. It's harder to notice narratives you aren't regularly exposed to, and it's hardest of all to notice the ones you yourself believe in. But if you don't, well, that's when you start to lose touch with reality. I don't know if Jesse Singal is watching this, but if you are, and if you got this far, I'd like to reward you by making a 100% bad faith, absurd criticism of you that you can use to ignore any better criticism I've made, if you feel so inclined. So, here goes. Jesse Singal is a pirate. He raids ships and steals their gold. You're welcome.